Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what you are about to hear does not fit into any of the narratives that Western governments or mainstream media have spent 30 years constructing about American military presence in the Persian Gulf. The story they have been telling is of a permanent American security architecture in the Gulf region, an architecture so embedded, so economically intertwined, so mutually beneficial to Gulf monarchies and Washington alike that its continuation was simply assumed. Air bases, prepositioning agreements, naval deployments, intelligence fusion centers. The architecture of American primacy in the Gulf was not supposed to be negotiable. It was supposed to be the permanent background condition of Middle Eastern geopolitics. It is not permanent. It is not immovable. And what is happening right now at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest American military installation in the Middle East, with approximately 10,000 American military personnel and the forward headquarters of United States Central Command, represents a rupture in that assumed permanence that American strategic planners are not prepared to explain to the public and are only beginning to prepare for operationally. Everyone is focused on the Gaza ceasefire. Everyone is watching whether the Israel-Saudi normalization talks are going to restart. Everyone is asking about Iranian nuclear negotiations. But right now, in Doha, something has been communicated to American military commanders that is not yet fully reflected in any public statement, and that will reshape the American military posture in the Gulf region for a generation. Qatar has served notice, and the notice is not a negotiating position. It is a deadline. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why Qatar has made this decision, what the operational consequences of losing Al Udeid would be for American military planning in the region, which countries are already positioning to benefit from this transformation, and what it tells us about the long-term trajectory of American influence in the Persian Gulf. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being tracked in military planning offices from Washington to Riyadh to Beijing, and it is not being explained to you anywhere else at this level of detail. To understand why the Al Udeid eviction notice represents something fundamentally different from previous Qatari-American tensions, you need to understand what Al Udeid actually is and what it does. Al Udeid Air Base, located approximately 35 kilometers southwest of Doha, is not simply a large air base. It is the command and control hub for American air operations across a geographic area stretching from Egypt to the India-Pakistan border. The Combined Air Operations Center located there has directed every American airstrike in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen over the past 2 decades. The prepositioning of munitions, fuel, and logistics assets at Al Udeid represents investments measured not in millions, but in billions of dollars. The intelligence integration between the base and American satellite, signals, and human intelligence networks in the region is decades in the making and not something that can be relocated in months. According to documentation from the United States Air Force's Central Command and Independent Defense Policy Analysis from the Stimson Center, there is no single facility in the Middle East or the broader Central Command area of responsibility that could absorb the functions currently concentrated at Al Udeid. Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean is too far. The base at Al Dhafra in the UAE has capacity limitations and its own political complications. The facilities in Kuwait and Bahrain are not configured for the command and control mission that Al Udeid performs. This is not a situation where American planners can simply move the sign from one door to another. Losing Al Udeid would require a fundamental restructuring of how American air power operates in the entire region east of the Suez Canal. Announcement number 1. Announced trains I-1. Why Qatar has decided that the American relationship has become a strategic liability rather than a strategic asset. The Qatari calculation has changed for reasons that are specific, documented, and traceable to 3 distinct developments of the past 5 years. The first is the Abraham Accords and the subsequent trajectory of Israeli-Arab normalization. Qatar's entire regional diplomatic identity has been built on its role as a mediator, a bridge between parties that do not speak to each other directly, a provider of good offices to Hamas, to the Taliban, to Iran, to factions in Libya and Sudan. Qatar's value as a mediator depended on its perceived neutrality and its willingness to engage with actors that Washington considers adversaries. The Abraham Accords framework and the pressure on Gulf states to normalize with Israel has been forcing Qatar into a binary choice between its mediation identity and its alignment with American strategic priorities. Qatar has been choosing its mediation identity. Washington has been expressing increasing frustration with that choice. The second development is the Gaza conflict and the unprecedented scale of public opinion pressure in Qatar's domestic political environment and across the Arab and Muslim world more broadly. Al Jazeera, the Qatari state media network, has been the most widely watched Arabic language news source covering Gaza, and its coverage has been graphic, comprehensive, and relentlessly critical of Israeli military operations and of American support for those operations. The Qatari government has been simultaneously hosting American military commanders at Al Udeid, hosting Hamas political leadership in Doha for ceasefire negotiations, and allowing Al Jazeera to broadcast images that have generated enormous public anger at American policy across the Muslim world. This contradiction has become, according to multiple Qatari diplomatic sources and analysis from the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, politically unsustainable inside Qatar itself. The third development is economic. Qatar has completed its strategic hedge. The North Dome gas field, the largest natural gas field in the world, shared with Iran, provides Qatar with energy export revenues that have made it one of the wealthiest countries per capita on Earth. Qatar has signed long-term liquefied natural gas supply agreements with European countries desperate to replace Russian gas, with Asian economies growing their energy consumption, and with American LNG terminals as part of a global supply network. Qatar's economic dependence on American security guarantees is not what it was in 1996 when the Al Udeid Agreement was first concluded. Qatar does not need American protection the way it once did. It has alternative security relationships, it has enormous financial leverage, and it has the diplomatic weight that comes from being indispensable to every major conflict mediation in the region. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, what the eviction means operationally and why the Pentagon's public confidence about alternatives is not matching its private planning conversations. American defense officials, when confronted with questions about Al Udeid's future, have consistently pointed to three alternative basing possibilities: enhanced cooperation with the UAE at Al Dhafra, expanded use of facilities in Bahrain, hosting the Fifth Fleet, and the development of over-the-horizon capabilities that reduce dependence on fixed bases in the Gulf region altogether. Each of these alternatives is real. Each has genuine merits, and each has specific limitations that make it an inadequate substitute for what Al Udeid currently provides. Al Dhafra in the UAE has 5,000 American military personnel and advanced facilities, but the UAE has simultaneously been developing its own independent security relationships, purchasing Chinese surveillance technology, negotiating with Russia on energy cooperation, and making clear to Washington that the F-35 aircraft deal remains frozen as long as the American side insists on restrictions that the UAE considers incompatible with sovereignty. The UAE is not a reliable unconditional host. Bahrain hosts the Fifth Fleet headquarters and is a critical naval facility, but its domestic political situation, a Sunni monarchy ruling over a Shia majority population with documented repression of Shia political movements, and with Iran as the permanently looming strategic threat across a narrow body of water, makes it a base that requires constant political management and is susceptible to the kind of domestic instability that the American military cannot fully insulate itself from. The over-the-horizon alternative is real as a concept. American military doctrine has been moving toward distributed expeditionary operations that rely less on large fixed bases. But doctrine and reality diverge significantly when the actual operational requirement is directing airstrikes across a 7 million square kilometer area of responsibility that includes simultaneous active conflicts in multiple countries. Over the horizon requires assets, and those assets need somewhere to be based. Stay with me, because this is where the strategic picture becomes even more complex than the pure military geography suggests. Announcement number 3, and this is the one that the mainstream press is almost entirely missing. The Chinese positioning that has been ongoing quietly while Western attention was directed elsewhere. China has no military base in Qatar. It has no formal defense agreement with Qatar, but China has been Qatar's largest single trading partner for the past several years. According to Qatari government trade statistics, China has been investing in Qatari infrastructure through Chinese state companies. Chinese construction firms built significant portions of the infrastructure for the 2022 World Cup. Chinese technology companies have been selling surveillance and telecommunications equipment to Qatari government agencies. And most significantly, Qatari LNG, that was previously committed entirely to Asian markets, has been attracting Chinese long-term supply agreements at a scale that makes China increasingly important to the economic foundation of the Qatari state. None of this constitutes a Chinese military alliance with Qatar. But it constitutes a web of economic relationships that gives Beijing significant informal influence over Qatari decision-making. And it means that any Qatari assessment of the consequences of asking American forces to leave Al Udeid must factor in Chinese readiness to help absorb any American economic or diplomatic retaliation that might follow. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now, let us be direct about what the mainstream narrative is getting wrong, because the framing of this story in the Western press, to the extent it is being covered at all, is deeply misleading. The framing being used is essentially that Qatar is engaging in a negotiating tactic, that the eviction notice is a bargaining chip to extract concessions from Washington on issues like the status of Hamas political leadership in Doha, the Al Jazeera situation, or American pressure on Qatar over its Iran policy. This framing has a comforting implication that American diplomacy can manage the situation back to the status quo. American diplomats say the right things, make the right concessions, reassure Qatari leadership, and the base remains. This framing is wrong about the current Qatari calculation for the same reason it has been wrong about similar situations across the Middle East for 30 years. It assumes that the fundamental interests of Gulf states are aligned with the American strategic presence, and that any deviance from that alignment is a negotiating tactic rather than a genuine strategic reassessment. Saudi Arabia in the 1990s was presumed to be a reliable, unconditional American partner. It turned out to be a more complicated partner than that presumption accommodated. The UAE in 2010 was presumed to be the most reliable American ally in the Gulf. By 2023, the UAE was conducting military exercises with China and purchasing Russian defense equipment. Pattern recognition is not a complicated analytical skill, but it seems to consistently elude American strategic planning with respect to Gulf states. The historical parallel here is the American experience at Clark Air Base and Subic Bay Naval Station in the Philippines, where the American military presence had been established in 1947 and was considered in Washington as a permanent fixture of the regional security architecture. It was not permanent. The Philippine Senate in 1991 voted against renewing the base agreements. The United States was given 1 year to leave. The Clark and Subic bases closed. American military planners adapted. The world did not end, but the regional military architecture was fundamentally changed, and the adaptation required was painful, expensive, and took years to complete. The Gulf is not the Philippines. The analogy is not exact, but the pattern of assumed permanence confronting political reality is the same. So where does this leave us? 3 paths forward. It could into Path 1, American diplomatic intervention, combined with specific concessions on issues including the status of Hamas political leadership in Doha, the pressure on Al Jazeera, and possibly a formal American security guarantee to Qatar that is more explicit than the current arrangements, produces a negotiated extension of the Al Udeid basing agreement under modified terms. Qatar retains leverage it has demonstrated. America retains the base it needs. Both sides claim a form of victory. The probability of this outcome depends entirely on whether American decision makers are willing to make concessions that domestic political dynamics in Washington make uncomfortable. The current domestic political environment in Washington does not favor concession making toward actors associated with Hamas. Path 2, the basing agreement formally lapses or is formally terminated. American forces begin an orderly drawdown from Al Udeid over a 12 to 36-month timeline. The operational functions of CENTCOM's Combined Air Operations Center are distributed among a combination of Al Dhafra, Bahrain, and a new over-the-horizon architecture that takes years to fully develop. During the transition period, American military capability in the region is genuinely degraded. Adversaries who understand this take actions calibrated to the transition window. Path 3, the situation is frozen in formal ambiguity. Qatar does not publicly formalize an eviction notice. American officials do not acknowledge the severity of the situation publicly. The base continues to operate while private negotiations produce neither a confirmed extension nor a formal termination. This is the most politically comfortable outcome for both governments in the short term and the most strategically dangerous in the medium term because it delays adaptation without resolving the underlying tension. I think path 3 is where we are right now. And I think path 2 becomes increasingly likely the longer path 3 continues. Here are the questions I want you to take away. If American air power in the Middle East is operationally degraded for 2 to 3 years during a transition away from Al Udeid, which regional actor is most likely to test that degraded capability? And what form would that test take? If Qatar successfully negotiates American withdrawal from Al Udeid on Qatari terms, what precedent does that set for every other Gulf state hosting American forces? And what does the loss of Al Udeid mean for the credibility of American security guarantees to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, and to every other regional partner that depends on American air power as the backstop of its security? Tell me in the comments what you think the most significant operational consequence of losing Al Udeid would be. Tell me whether you think American diplomacy will find a formula that avoids the closure, or whether the base closure is now inevitable, regardless of what Washington offers. We will keep tracking every development at Al Udeid and across the American military posture in the Gulf region. Subscribe now, share this analysis. Turn on notifications and we will see you in the next one. There is a dimension of the Al Udeid story that I have not yet addressed and that I think is the most strategically consequential element for the 5 to 10 year time frame. What the Gulf states collectively draw from watching how Washington responds to Qatar's eviction notice. The Gulf Cooperation Council states have always maintained a careful balance in their relationship with the United States. They have hosted American bases, purchased American weapons, aligned their currencies with the dollar, and participated in American-led security frameworks. In exchange, they have received a security umbrella that allowed them to punch above their demographic weight in regional politics, deterrence against Iranian military ambitions, and access to American markets and technology. This arrangement has worked with periodic tensions for 4 decades. But the structural conditions that made this arrangement logical from a Gulf state perspective have been changing for a decade. American energy independence achieved through the shale revolution has reduced the strategic imperative that originally drove American commitment to Gulf security. The American domestic political consensus in favor of forward military deployment overseas has been eroding since at least 2003 and has been openly contested by significant political movements on both left and right. The Abraham Accords and subsequent normalization diplomacy created a new regional architecture in which Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are developing a security community that does not require American military presence as its organizing principle in the same way it did previously. If Qatar successfully forces a renegotiation of the Al Udeid arrangement, the other Gulf states will draw a lesson. The lesson will not be that America is weak. America has enormous residual power and relationships that cannot be dissolved overnight. The lesson will be that American basing agreements are negotiable in ways they were not previously assumed to be, and that the domestic political cost in Washington of losing a Gulf base is lower than American diplomatic statements have historically suggested. That lesson, once internalized, changes the leverage calculus in every future negotiation between Washington and Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Manama, and Doha. What we are watching in the Al Udeid situation is not simply a Qatar-America bilateral dispute. We are watching the renegotiation of the terms of American presence in the Gulf at a systemic level. Qatar is the leading edge of that renegotiation because Qatar has the financial security to absorb American displeasure, the diplomatic relationships to cushion the economic consequences, and the mediation role in regional conflicts that gives it a kind of indispensability to American policy that Saudi Arabia and the UAE cannot claim in quite the same way at this specific moment. But the renegotiation that Qatar is leading will not stop at Qatar. Tell me in the comments what you think the most significant long-term consequence of a potential Al Udeid closure would be for American strategic posture in the broader Middle East. We will keep tracking every development in the American military presence in the Gulf and across the entire regional security architecture. Subscribe now. Share this analysis, turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next one. I want to close with an observation about the nature of American grand strategy that the Al Udeid situation illustrates with unusual clarity. American foreign policy in the Middle East has been organized around the concept of forward military presence since the Carter Doctrine of 1980, which declared that any attempt by an outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region would be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States and would be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. That doctrine was a response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Iranian Revolution. It shaped 4 decades of American military deployment, base agreement negotiation, and strategic relationship building across the Gulf. The Carter Doctrine assumed that the primary threat to Gulf stability was external, specifically Soviet, and that American military presence was the necessary and sufficient response to that threat. Neither assumption remains accurate. The Soviet Union does not exist. The primary challenges to Gulf stability in 2026 are internal, regional, and structural in ways that American military presence cannot resolve and arguably exacerbates. But the institutional infrastructure of American military presence, the bases, the agreements, the prepositioning, the command structures, persists because institutional infrastructure is far easier to build than to adapt or dismantle, and because every specific element of that infrastructure has American contractors, American jobs, American political constituencies, and American military careers attached to it. The Al Udeid situation is therefore not simply a story about Qatar. It is a story about the gap between the strategic rationale that created a forward military presence 40 years ago and the strategic reality that presence now operates in. Closing that gap would require American strategic culture to acknowledge that presence designed to deter the Soviet Union is not automatically appropriate for managing the challenges of 2026, and that the unwillingness to close bases whose strategic rationale has expired is itself a form of strategic rigidity that reduces American adaptability and ultimately diminishes American influence. That acknowledgement is unlikely to come from inside the American national security establishment. It will have to be forced from outside by allies and partners who decide, as Qatar appears to be deciding, that the terms of the existing arrangements no longer serve their interests. That is an uncomfortable way to update a strategy, but it may be the only way the update happens.